And before this video begins, I would just like to tell you that I have a PO box until early December. So if you want to send me any like fan mail or like jokey things for me to open in Patreon videos, or if I get enough in an actual video on the main channel, just send it to this address, and yeah, just thought I'd let you know. Anyway, on with the video. I'd like to give a special shout out to my Asbantium level patron, Fallon Cortez. The Companions are one of the cornerstones of Doctor Who, having added an important dimension to the show ever since 1963. They often go beyond simple supporting characters, and even serve as the centerpiece of entire story arcs. But as the saying goes, all good things must come to an end, and it's inevitable for every companion to leave the TARDIS in some form or another. But what happens to these characters afterwards? Well, thanks to the wealth of expanded media, we know the fates of almost all Doctor Who companions, even after their travels have long since ended. So in this very big video, I'll be exploring what happened to all these companions. Obviously, for the sake of brevity, I won't be covering expanded media companions like Bernice Summerfield or characters like River Song and Captain Jack Harkness, because they're so complicated we'd be here all day. So to keep things simple, I'll only be talking about companions from the TV show, and I'll try my best to make sense of all the inconsistent timelines. So beware spoilers for countless Doctor Who stories, because this is what happened to every Doctor Who companion. Susan Foreman. One of the most iconic companions in status, if not in writing quality, Susan was the Doctor's granddaughter and first televised companion. Even though she was smart and capable, she spent more time as a captive or twisting her glass ankles. The young Time Lord ultimately left the TARDIS when the Doctor forced her to remain on 22nd Century Earth with her new love interest David Campbell. The couple would settle down and help to rebuild the Earth after the Dalek invasion. One source states that they would be unable to naturally conceive, so they adopted 3 children. Ian, Barbara and David Jr. They saw little of each other, and Susan's agelessness caused friction within the family, although a 54-year-old David would often return home from late night drinking to find Susan playing up to one of his fantasies. I hope that doesn't mean what I think it means. So we'll just shovel that to the side and instead follow the timeline presented by Big Finish, in which Susan gave birth to the half-human, half-Time Lord Alex 10 years after she left the TARDIS, and David passed away from a Dalek virus several years later. Now a single mother in the midst of post-Dalek politics, Susan wanted to send Alex to Gallifrey for Time Lord education, only for the 8th Doctor to try and take him on as a companion. However, Alex was killed by the Daleks, and the Doctor left Susan alone to mourn. Now widowed and without a son, Susan began to live in the abandoned shell of Coal Hill School and eventually discovered hypercubes from her home planet, begging her to enlist in the Time War. Despite the Doctor's desperate efforts to hide these cubes from her, Susan joined the war and reunited with an older Ian to fight the Sensorites. After some more missions against the Daleks, Susan ended up in Shoreditch 1963, where she and the 8th Doctor helped fight the Daleks over the Hand of Omega, before the Doctor returned her to Gallifrey, and her fate after the Time War is unknown, although she is considered dead. Ian Chesterton and Barbara Wright. When the Doctor and Susan were laying low in 20th Century Earth, the latter was enrolled in Coal Hill School, leading to her teachers Ian and Barbara essentially being kidnapped by the Doctor, who then couldn't get them home until many adventures later, when they returned to London 1965, 2 years after disappearing. They returned to their teaching jobs and claimed to have spent the last 2 years doing missionary work in Africa, although most people didn't believe them. At some point they were pulled into an illusory world, where the 11th Doctor helped them defeat a vengeful, technologically advanced tribe of Gum, and the pair then married, with the Doctor as Ian's best man. The couple had a son named John, who would become a pop singer under the stage name Johnny Chess, and Ian became both a science lecturer and a professor in astronomy. Barbara also became a lecturer, specialising in Aztec history. She kept a personal diary she planned to leave for Susan in Earth's future. By the 2010s, both Ian and Barbara were professors at Cambridge, and Ian became the chairman of the governors for Coal Hill School, along with having an adventure with the 5th Doctor and other companions, along with a brief reunion with an older Susan during the Time War. The couple was still alive circa 2020, where they attended Sarah Jane Smith's funeral, and Ian started attending meetings with other former companions, although by Susan's time there was an oak tree planted at Coal Hill School in memory of the 2 teachers. Vicki Pallister and Katarina. After the departure of Susan, the Doctor rescued Vicki Pallister from a crashed spaceship and she went on to fill the young female role the trio were missing. However, shortly after the departures of Ian and Barbara, Vicki would leave too, staying behind in 1200 BC with Prince Troilus of Troy. However, they would struggle to settle down, especially because of Vicki's issues with the technological and cultural inferiority of the past. However, after settling in Carthage, the couple had 2 children and Vicki looked back on her time with the Doctor fondly, writing memoirs and recounting stories of her adventures to her granddaughter Sophia. When Vicki left the TARDIS, she essentially traded places with Katarina, a young Greek girl who began travelling with the Doctor and Stephen. These adventures were very short-lived though, as Katarina soon died after being sucked out of an airlock. She would find herself in the afterlife, unable to cross the River Styx, although a manifestation of her idea of the First Doctor allowed her to enter Elysian Fields, the Greek equivalent of heaven. Meanwhile, her dead body was recovered by River Song and stolen by the renegade Time Lord, the Nine, although the residual Archon energy in her body distracted him and caused his defeat at the hands of other companions. So in the end, Katarina was actually helpful, even if she had to die to be. Stephen Taylor. Despite the fame of Susan and her 2 teachers within the Doctor Who fanbase, the longest serving First Doctor companion was Stephen Taylor, a pilot from the far future who the Doctor rescued from the Mechanoids. He went on to battle Daleks, the Celestial Toymaker and the Meddling Monk, before he decided to leave the Doctor to help with the diplomacy of a socially divided alien planet. Stephen would set up a number of schools to educate the so-called savages, along with bearing 3 daughters, one of whom he named after Dodo. However, when she was assassinated and his other 2 daughters began to demand parts of his kingdom, King Stephen abdicated to allow the people to self-govern. He did have to enlist the help of a mid-regeneration First Doctor to put down the rise of a tyrannical copy of the Time Lord's mind, but apart from that, Stephen ended up living a very simple life in a mountain cabin, telling his granddaughter Cedar all about his travels in the TARDIS. Dodo. Possibly the second most unpopular companion behind Adric, Dodo was a rather forgettable and grating TARDIS occupant, and her departure is one of the most absurd, as she simply disappears from the middle of the war machines, leaving to go live in Hertfordshire where her people need her. Not much has ever really been solidly confirmed about Dodo's later life, although one grim account claims the former companion ended up plagued by visions of her adventures, which she no longer believed even happened to her. After a number of blackouts, she was sent to a psychiatric hospital, forced to undergo shock therapy over the course of 14 months, and she killed her fellow patient in self-defense after he tried to force himself upon her. After this, Dodo was sent to unit psychiatric facility the Glass House, where she was interrogated by the Master and had even more of her memory wiped. She then ended up homeless, but she found a new lease of life when she met journalist James Stephens in 1970. They became lovers and Dodo moved in, becoming pregnant with his child. However, before she could tell him the good news, she was shot and killed by someone the Master had conditioned. So all in all, it was a completely awful life and she went the way of her namesake. However, a much happier account suggests she lived well past the 1970s and had a relationship with a man called Bill while she worked as a secretary, and she didn't have to deal with all the psychiatric stuff. One day she had a chance encounter with Sarah Jane Smith, who accidentally dropped her diary, which Dodo then returned. Dodo would then be present at Sarah Jane's funeral in 2020, and that's all we know. Ben Jackson and Polly Wright. Dodo's surprise departure left the Doctor all alone for the first time in the show. However, he quickly took on new companions in the form of sailor Ben Jackson and posh secretary Polly Wright. Together they would accompany the First Doctor on his final adventures and follow the Second Doctor throughout the universe, before they found themselves back on Earth on the exact same day they left. Ben had always yearned to return to his ship, the HMS Teaser, so they took the opportunity to leave and return to their lives. They soon entered a romantic relationship and Ben proposed in 1966 on top of the post office tower, but Polly's parents disapproved and the relationship didn't last. Ben ended up in a loveless marriage and never really got over Polly, who married a man named Simon and gave birth to his son Mikey. However, she then realised she was also unhappy in her relationship. So in 1986, she and Ben secretly reunited in a hotel room, but their potential affair was interrupted by a drunk man and the moment was lost, so Polly left. At some point after this, Simon died, putting a strain on Polly's relationship with her son, who once walked in on her having a one-night stand with a sailor. I guess she had a type.
Do you know any place where sailors hang out?
In 1992 she became a socialite as the personal assistant of music manager John Maurice, even inheriting his company GEZ. Polly became a public figure, although she suffered from bulimia and had a brief marriage with a closeted gay boy band singer. She made a habit of attending celebrity funerals solely to get her face in the papers, but this eventually led to a time-travelling incident which reunited her with the Doctor, Jamie and a divorced Ben, who had been spending a lonely New Year's Day running his pub in Sydenham 13 years after failing to recapture his love. However, this time Ben confessed his love for Polly and they married in 2009, when Polly was working in a government office and having an adventure with fellow associates of the Doctor, the Brigadier and Thomas Brewster. She also found herself transported to the Death Zone where she killed a Sontaran with a stiletto heel. When she returned to Earth, she and Ben started running an orphanage in India, and they, like everyone else in this list, attended Sarah Jane's funeral in 2020. Victoria Waterfield. Victoria Waterfield was a very unfortunate companion, a young 15-year-old Victorian girl whose father was ruthlessly killed by the Daleks who had enslaved and puppeted him. With no home or family to return to, Victoria battled the Cybermen, the Ice Warriors and the Great Intelligence before deciding she wasn't cut out for the time and space lifestyle. So she settled down with foster parents in 1968, although the 7th Doctor soon took her back to her previous century to briefly deal with her father's fortune and say goodbye to her aunt. At some point Victoria married and had several children, with a grandchild expected in 2008. However, she never told her family of her identity as a Victorian or her TARDIS travel. In 1980, Victoria returned to Tibet, where the Great Intelligence manipulated her once again, this time making her set up the cult-like New World University so it could infect Earth's computer networks. However, in 1995, she was able to break free and help the Brigadier and Sarah Jane defeat the villain. Victoria eventually became a protester against nuclear energy and helped the 6th Doctor and Peri defeat a genocidal plan orchestrated by the terrible Zodin. Victoria was still alive by 2020 when, you guessed it, she was a guest at Sarah Jane's funeral. Jamie McCrimmon. The most iconic companion of the 2nd Doctor era, Jamie McCrimmon travelled with the Doctor for almost his entire second incarnation, only absent from the power of the Daleks. Throughout this time he grew incredibly close with the Doctor, so he was ultimately forced to leave him behind when the Time Lords caught up to the trio and wiped Jamie's mind of every adventure he had after the Highlanders. However, while the Doctor was working for the Time Lords before his punishment regeneration, Jamie's memories were temporarily restored so he could assist the Doctor as they joined forces with the 6th Doctor and Peri to fight Sontarans. The duo would continue undertaking missions across time and space, even crossing paths with the 3rd Doctor and Liz Shaw, but at some point Jamie was once again returned to his natural time without any memories. He then married Kirsty McLaren and they got very busy, having at least 8 children and numerous grandchildren. One of their distant descendants, Heather McCrimmon, would even go on to become a companion of the 10th Doctor. Despite the Celestial Intervention Agency offering Jamie his memories back, he refused because he had a good life with Kirsty. However, when he was struck by lightning one day, he began to remember his adventures with the Doctor. So when the 6th Doctor encountered an elderly Jamie, he recognised the Time Lord and sacrificed himself to destroy the Cybermen's World Shaper device, which aged him to death. Zoe Heriot. For the latter half of the 2nd Doctor's life, Jamie was joined by the futuristic young super genius Zoe Heriot, who was also sent back to her home with her memories of her time and space adventures erased. This caused a great strain on Zoe, who put 2 and 2 together to realise she had aged after her initial encounter with the Doctor, and worked out she must have had other adventures. Shortly after her return to the Wheel in space, the Cybermen attacked again, converting Zoe into a cyberplanner, which caused some of her memories to resurface. She defeated the villains by pulling them into the land of fiction, summoning the real Doctor and a fictional Jamie to defeat the Cybermen. However, she once again lost her memories and sought psychiatric counselling after years of detailed dreams of her forgotten adventures. By her late 50s, Zoe was a solitary and shut-in woman because of her memory damage affecting her ability to form relationships. Her past with the Doctor made her a target of the Company, who threatened her with the death penalty unless she proved she had travelled in time and shared the secrets of time travel with them. Zoe underwent multiple sessions of memory recovery, eventually leading her back to the space station Artemis, where she had been with the Doctor and Jamie during the outbreak of a virus. However, she arrived at the same time as her previous adventure was already happening, the older Zoe even saving the life of her younger self. Ultimately, the older Zoe would return to the attempts to recover her memory, although this time willingly, with Jen, her jailer who had now fled the Company. Brigadier Lethbridge Stewart. The Brigadier was never really a proper companion in the traditional sense, not holding a conventional role in the show. However, after his last regular appearance in Terror of the Zygons, the Brigadier would see a lot of action as the leader of UNIT, although the 7th Doctor would hypnotise him into retirement and he would become an A-level maths teacher. The Brig kept finding himself pulled back into the world of UNIT though, always ending up in trouble or independently investigating. Indeed, in 1995, he helped to stop the Great Intelligence's plan alongside Victoria and Sarah Jane, before he retired from teaching and married his second wife Doris, although he still found himself involved with UNIT missions throughout the 90s and 2000s, helping to defeat Morgaine and the Destroyer, along with also defeating the Fourth Reich led by a secret son of Adolf Hitler. As age caught up to the Brigadier, he became a scientific advisor at UNIT, and often found himself in Peru, missing the chance to see his old friend the Doctor again. However, he maintained his close friendship with Sarah Jane, and helped her defeat the villainous Bane. In his later years, the Brigadier lived in a care home, visited only by his daughter Kate, although the curator would secretly visit him regularly to play Risk, and he'd hide under the bed whenever Kate came over. The Brigadier then passed away peacefully on Friday, 16th December 2011, with Doris and Kate by his side, although he wished the Doctor might visit him, his final words being, "Maybe tomorrow." Every incarnation of the Doctor attended his funeral in 2012, along with a number of former companions. However, when Missy attempted to convert every dead body on Earth into Cybermen, the Brigadier was one of her victims, although he saved his daughter and shot the Master, before he then self-destructed so he couldn't pose a danger to anyone else. Hey, I'm just telling the story, don't shoot the messenger here. John Benton and Mike Yates. Alongside the Brigadier, the most notable members of UNIT in the classic era were Benton and Yates, who often found themselves involved in all the chaos of being associated with the Doctor. However, Yates was kicked out of UNIT after his involvement with Operation Golden Age, a villainous plan to resurrect dinosaurs in the modern day and take over the world. Yates did redeem himself, but he moved on to a simple life, sitting on the council for Upper Warderwick in Kent, and in 2009 he was running an ecology project in San Francisco. At some point after his retirement, Yates was drawn to Nest Cottage, where he reunited with the 4th Doctor and battled the Hornets, which were alien hornets. The Doctor eventually gave Yates a dog called Captain, and they would all go on a fantastical adventure in the form of the Demon Quest arc, before Mike would play an integral role defending the village of Hexford from the Skishtari. Meanwhile, his former colleague Benton temporarily left UNIT to become a used car salesman, although by 1983 he was back in the fold. When 1999 rolled around, Benton was married with 3 children and worked in a UNIT office, with the rank of Regimental Sergeant Major. In the 2010s, Benton had retired and owned a pub called the White Hart alongside his wife Marjorie, although he was recalled into action alongside the reinstated Captain Yates and Joe Jones as they battled the Sea Devils in 2014. Liz Shaw. One of the only people on this list to never actually have travelled in the TARDIS on the show, Liz Shaw was the 3rd Doctor's lab assistant, although she left off screen due to her scientist friend Jean being converted into a Cyberman. Liz became a professor engaged to a fellow scientist named Michael, but he was killed after becoming infected and became a Primord, an event which forced the Doctor, the Brig and Joe Grant to intervene. A while afterwards, the Doctor and Joe would finally take Liz on a trip on the TARDIS, travelling to 1916 St. Petersburg. She would continue to associate with the Doctor and UNIT, having one-off Earthbound adventures. In the 1990s, Liz formed the Preternatural Research Bureau, also known as PROBE, which was a special division of the Ministry of Defence designed to investigate anything out of the ordinary. Despite the limited support and non-existent budget, PROBE solved a number of cases, expanding significantly into the 2010s, and Liz would marry her co-worker Patsy Haggard, the couple retiring to Spain. However, Liz wasn't content with retirement, and regularly helped with probe investigations, including a sorceress kidnapping Liz's granddaughter from a previous relationship. She also travelled to the moon on a number of occasions, including being on the UNIT moon base in 2010, when the 11th Doctor's funeral was taking place. Liz would continue to help both Probe and UNIT on and off, before her death sometime before 2050. Joe Grant / Joe Jones. Liz's time on the show is always eclipsed by her successor, Joe Grant, who took her place as an assistant and accompanied the 3rd Doctor on his journeys into the stars after his ability to use the TARDIS was restored. However, after a great many number of adventures, Joe left to marry Clifford Jones, and they would travel the Amazon River on their honeymoon, the first of many journeys around the world. By 2010, they were still happily married with 7 children and 12 grandchildren, with a 13th on the way. They dedicated their time to activism, and Jo always waited for the Doctor to return, which he didn't do until an adventure with Sarah Jane at his supposed funeral. After reconciling with the 11th Doctor, who revealed he had been checking up on her, Jo had some brief and chaotic adventures with her Time Lord doppelganger Iris Wildtime, where she met the 3rd and 8th Doctors, really making up for all those lost encounters. In 2012, Jo attended the funeral of her old friend the Brigadier, and later on Kate Stewart recruited her for a mission involving the Sea Devils, where Jo and Osgood would unsuccessfully strive for peaceful negotiations between the two races. After the incident, Jo would help Captain Jack prevent the return of giant maggots in Wales. However, later on she would face a very traumatic experience when the War Master used hypnotic spores on Jo to convince her he was her uncle, meaning he could use her to steal a vial from the unit archives. When she tried to stop him, he corrupted all of her memories and suggested he had been manipulating her since childhood, even getting her the job at UNIT. When he left, Jo was still in a state of shock because she no longer knew what was real. However, she had recovered by the time she started meeting up with a number of other former companions. Jo Jones would eventually die in a house fire in 2028 at the age of 77. Harry Sullivan. Rounding off our tour of unit personnel, Harry Sullivan was a lovable fish out of water trapped on a chaotic voyage with the eccentric 4th Doctor. After defeating the Zygons, Harry chose to stay on Earth. Although as a unit member, he still occasionally worked with the Doctor's many incarnations, but at some point he developed a Zygon killing gas the Time Lord heavily disapproved of. Most notably though, Harry rejoined the Doctor and Sarah for a picnic on a Scottish island where villagers were being converted into living scarecrows controlled by Cybermen and their mysterious benefactor Scratchman. After this, Harry returned to travelling with the Doctor and companion Naomi Cross, although the duo were left in the 2010s and joined Kate Stewart's unit, where they continued to battle alien threats. At some point, however, Harry returned to his correct time and worked at NATO, along with becoming Deputy Director at MI5. Sarah Jane had yearly meetings with Harry, but by 2010 he had been missing in action for a while. However, by 2015 he was alive and well and had discovered a possible cure for HIV. So good on him. Sarah Jane Smith. I'll try to keep this one as brief as possible because we all know the story of Sarah Jane Smith, arguably the most iconic Doctor Who companion of all time. After being stranded in Aberdeen by the Doctor, Sarah Jane found K9 on Christmas 1981, a present from the Doctor. Together they began to investigate supernatural happenings such as cults and witchcraft covens. In 1983, she became swept up in the Doctor's business in the Death Zone on Gallifrey, reuniting her with the Time Lord, and she also met other companions. Upon her return, she broke through as a journalist and became a very successful science fiction writer, drawing upon her adventures with the Doctor. Throughout the 90s, she continued to work independently, although K9 broke down, and in 1998 her aunt Lavinia passed away, leaving Sarah Jane a sizable inheritance. She continued her investigative work into the 2000s, travelling around the world to stop threats alongside her friend Josh Townsend, who eventually turned out to be a killer for a cult. You know, the usual. At some point, Sarah Jane moved into 13 Bannerman Road, where she set up her Xylox supercomputer Mr. Smith. She would reunite with the Doctor in his 10th form as they stopped the Krillitane scheme, with Sarah turning down his offer to travel with him. Instead, she'd continue doing her work with a new K9 and a team of plucky school kids, including her adopted synthetic son Luke and her adopted alien daughter Skye. For multiple years, they would battle the Slitheen, the Sontarans, Jadoon, and the Trickster, who became Sarah Jane's ultimate archenemy. She would have multiple run-ins with the Doctor, even meeting the 11th Doctor at his own supposed funeral. Sarah Jane never settled down, with her closest thing to a romance being nothing more than a scheme by the Trickster. Instead, she preferred her family dynamic with Luke and his friends, sending her son off to university where he'd meet his future husband Sanjay. The so-called Bannerman Road Gang would continue their adventures for many years, until Sarah Jane passed away 5 years into Luke's marriage, and almost every living companion attended her funeral, although there was some speculation that she instead left for more adventures with the Doctor. Leela. Often suffering from the same issue Martha Jones would later encounter, Leela had to follow on from the most iconic and widely beloved companion of her respective era. However, as an alien savage, she was a very interesting presence in the show, so it was surprising when she chose to stay on Gallifrey with K9 and marry the Time Lord Andred. When the 5th Doctor was the Time Lord President, Leela served as an advisor and a bit of a bodyguard, duties which would become more prevalent with President Romana. She served as a fiercely loyal protector, helping Romana navigate countless diplomatic situations and battles. However, a regenerated android was murdered and K9 was blown up during the bombing of a prototype TARDIS. And during the Time Lord Civil War, Leela herself was blinded by a bomb. She kept fighting though, even travelling across alternate universe Gallifreys as she suddenly started to age, although she was regaining her sight. She freed slaves and overthrew Daleks before Romana sent her on a mission to Victorian London, where Leela briefly reunited with Jago and Lightfoot. When Romana stepped down as president, she and Leela continued to deal with political threats and turmoil, but everything changed with the outbreak of the Time War. Leela served as the CIA's liaison with the War Council, and Romana tasked her with travelling with the War Master to gather intelligence, but in traditional Master fashion, he threw her into the Time Vortex. After Leela was rescued, she was conscripted by Rassilon, and had to fight in the war despite her own personal objections, briefly teaming up with the War Doctor himself. Leela managed to survive the supposed destruction of Gallifrey, but she became a prisoner of the Xene and began to age rapidly away from Gallifrey, so she eventually died in prison, her soul reborn as a young girl named Emily. Yeah, I don't know how that makes sense either. Romana. Due to the importance of the search for the key to time, the Doctor was paired up with Romana, a younger, more uptight Time Lord who continued to travel with him until she decided to remain in E-Space before making her own way back to Gallifrey. She would ascend to the position of Time Lord President, although she was soon kidnapped by the Daleks and spent 2 decades in captivity before the 6th Doctor rescued her. Romana carefully navigated Time Lord society through a number of crises, having to constantly put down plots and schemes against both her and her people. She was manipulated by the conniving Inquisitor Darkle into appointing the Doctor's brother Braxitil as her High Chancellor, although he was quickly exiled. However, the issues with Darkle exploded into a full-blown civil war, and Romana was temporarily replaced as president. Alongside Leela, Romana visited a number of alternate timeline Gallifreys and prevented the Dalek invasion of the multiverse. Upon her return, Romana was reinstated as president, and began to rebuild the planet, which was crippled by war and disease. However, by the time of the outbreak of the Time War, she had once again resigned and now served as coordinator of the Celestial Intervention Agency, with on and off friend Narvin as her deputy. However, they were unable to prevent a scheme to resurrect Rassilon as the new warmongering president, the pair even exiled for attempting to assassinate President Rassilon. The duo continued to fight for a diplomatic and moral end to the war even during their exile, but Rassilon would soon catch up to them and imprison Romana inside a pocket dimension. Originally she would have regenerated into Romana 3 and serve as the president during the War in Heaven, but Braxitil travelled back in time and prevented the regeneration at Romana's own request, in order to avert the conflict and all the devastation. The timelines get very confusing, but as far as we know, Romana is missing or dead after the end of the Time War. Adric. Probably the most derided companion of all time for his cocky and smug attitude, young Adric famously died, but not actually on screen. In fact, rather than crashing into prehistoric Earth, the 5th Doctor created a bubble universe for Adric to survive in, only for the companion to tame giant scorpions and rule a city for 500 years, hoping to get revenge on the Doctor for leaving him to die, and also planning on marrying Nyssa. However, the scorpions turned against Adric to prevent him from leaving the universe, and Adric redeemed himself by helping Thomas Brewster save the Doctor and Nyssa. After all of this, Adric then finally died for good, although he found himself in the Nethersphere to Missy's delight. Nyssa. Nyssa of Traken was a smart and lonely young scientific genius until the Master turned her world upside down by stealing the body of her very own father. Believing her entire race was wiped out, Nyssa began to travel with the Doctor, Adric and Tegan. Nyssa spent a lot of time alongside the Doctor, one of the most well-documented companions of them all, as she went on all sorts of adventures. Like, seriously, there are a lot. However, this long history of travelling came to an end after Nyssa contracted Lazar's disease, a brutal illness comparable to leprosy. However, after she was cured, Nyssa decided to remain on the space station terminus to work on distributing a cure throughout the universe. She would then travel far and wide, taking a number of lovers, which probably made Adric roll in his nethersphere grave. Nyssa eventually found herself operating the Traken, a hospital ship in the Time War. She also came face to face with the War Master, who tried to manipulate Nyssa into developing a deadly plague, although he was unsuccessful and abandoned her on the quarantined ship, the Varnomium. At some point, Nyssa married a man named Lasarsi, and they had 2 children, Nika and Adric. She also had an android named Loki, who assisted her in her attempts to cure Richter's syndrome, a truly vicious and unbearable fatal affliction. This ultimately reunited her with the Doctor, Tegan and Turlough 50 years after she had left them. Nyssa joined them for multiple adventures on the condition that they would take her home to dispense the Richter syndrome cure. These journeys saw her facing off against the Centaurans, Eldrad, and literal rats. By the time Nyssa returned home, it had been 25 years and she was presumed dead. Lazarti had passed away and Nika was in suspended animation, having been infected with Richter's syndrome. Nyssa and her son Adric developed a cure together and planned to meet in 1 month's time to cure Nika, but Nyssa never ended up returning. Indeed, the TARDIS became temporarily trapped in E-space, with Nyssa beginning to die of entropy. She decided to remain in E-space to open a portal for the others to return, and she stayed there for at least another decade, treating the sick. But by some accounts, she seems to have returned to our universe to settle down with Tegan in 21st century Australia. Tegan Jovanka. Hailing from very humble and rebellious beginnings, Tegan Jovanka crossed paths with the Doctor when she was heading for her first day of work as an air stewardess. Despite repeated attempts to return the abrasive Australian to Heathrow, Tegan ended up becoming a companion and encountered a great many enemies, including a giant snake. However, a traumatic encounter with the Daleks forced Tegan to leave the TARDIS out of disgust, and she ran away from the Doctor, that bond broken. She was now alone on Earth 3 years after disappearing, and she had no explanation for where she had been, along with having no money or possessions. Some sources state that she initially travelled the globe until she decided to get her job back. This instantly threw her right back into the TARDIS, this time dealing with Centaurans alongside the 6th Doctor. After this brief outing, they reconciled and she began to move on with her life, returning to her father's farm in Brisbane in 1987 and taking over his animal feed company when he died. In the 90s, she responded to a small magazine advert regarding the TARDIS, which led her to meet up with Sarah Jane, Liz Shaw, Joe Grant and Ace as they shared wine and memories of their time with the Doctor. Tegan also began a relationship with her colleague Michael Tanaka, but she broke it off in 2006 when she discovered an inoperable tumour resulting from brain damage she had developed during the TARDIS travels. She was given just a year to live and refused the Doctor's offers of travelling again or finding a cure, because she was happy with her life and resumed her relationship with Michael. However, she was still alive in the 2010s, when she was campaigning for Aboriginal rights, and according to one account she later ended a relationship with Nyssa, probably causing Adric to turn in his crater. However, Power of the Doctor claims she has 2 ex-husbands and a son, throwing the Nyssa relationship into some doubt, although it was not entirely disputed, so it may still be a thing. By 2022, Tegan had come into contact with Ace and the two began working for UNIT. This ultimately led Tegan to reunite with the 13th Doctor and make amends for their fractured relationship thanks to the appearance of the 5th Doctor via a hologram AI. After helping the 13th Doctor defeat her greatest enemies, Tegan began to regularly meet with other former companions in emotional support sessions. Kamelion. Kamelion was a shape-shifting android used by the Master to manipulate history, but he soon became a short-lived companion. And I mean short-lived, because the Doctor was forced to destroy Kamelion due to the Master's control over the robot. However, because of his link with the TARDIS and the Doctor himself, Kamelion manifested in a few new forms, and the 6th Doctor and Peri one day discovered that Kamelion had had a child with the TARDIS, which developed into a double of Peri, so she was left on Earth in the real Peri's place so she could continue travelling. Vislor Turlough. Turlough was an alien exile masquerading as a human schoolboy, who made a deal to kill the Doctor only to refuse and become one of the most forgettable companions instead. However, when he learned of his father's death, he and his brother Malcolm returned to their home planet Tryon now that political prisoners were welcome again. He was heralded as a hero for returning from exile, but he declined a career in politics and instead worked on a space-time vessel with the aim to prevent the entropic decay of N-space. He and his friend Duras were joined by a Time Lord called the Magician, although this, of course, led to some complex timeline shenanigans as always. Later in life, Turlough was visited by the 10th Doctor and companion Emily Winter. Before growing old in Tryon and learning life's most valuable lesson, there's more than one Australian in the universe. Peri Brown. American companion Peri Brown was the daughter of archaeologists, which made her a natural fit for travels with the 5th Doctor, who even gave his own life to save hers. She would spend a lot more time with the 6th Doctor until the events of his trial, where the Time Lords reminded him of an adventure he had with Peri on the planet of Thoros Beta. And here's where things get a little bit complicated, because Peri has one of the most confusing post-TARDIS histories of them all. Different competing Time Lord factions were constantly meddling with her timeline and rewriting her life, leading to multiple separate versions of Peri living very different lives. Originally, Peri's mind was erased and replaced by the consciousness of the villainous Lord Kiv, leading to an enraged and horrified Ikanos killing the possessed Peri. However, one Time Lord faction pulled her out at the last minute, allowing her to live as the Warrior Queen alongside Ikanos. She would go on to have 3 children with him, and at least 3 grandchildren, with twin boys who would fight a civil war against each other. Alternatively, one Time Lord president believed this life was unfair to Peri, so he removed a different permutation of her from her timeline and sent her back to 1980s Earth, erasing her memories of the Doctor. However, she would ultimately end up marrying her childhood sweetheart Davy Silverman, who was incredibly abusive to the extent she was rendered infertile and needed facial reconstructive surgery. This inspired Peri to become a relationship counsellor, and eventually she hosted a talk show called Dr. Peri Brown, Warrior Queen. Get it? Warrior, like warrior? It was basically Dr. Phil without the ranch. In her late 40s, this version of Peri reunited with the Doctor and she found out about her other selves, with the Doctor attempting to apologise for what the Time Lords had done to her. However, she declined his invitation to travel again and returned to her life in America in 2009. Lastly, a version of Queen Peri was actually revealed to be a pawn of Mandrake, the Doctor's childhood imaginary enemy, which manifested as a mind parasite and killed Ikanos a week after the wedding. Over the course of 5 years, Mandrake attempted to stage a coup of all the kingdoms, but Peri was actually sterile, and none of the other rulers would marry her. The Doctor returned and saved Peri, restoring her real consciousness and taking her on as a companion again. They went on a number of adventures, including the 22nd century Dalek invasion of Earth, along with battling the Rani again. Once a year, every year, however, Peri would visit a temple dedicated to her late husband so that she could pay her respects. She even invited the palace guard Rex aboard the TARDIS, and they all flew off together, and that's the latest we know. Melanie Bush. Despite advanced knowledge of mathematics and computer coding, Mel Bush was pretty much known only for one thing: screaming at every shadow. This didn't stop her from joining the 6th and 7th Doctors for a number of adventures in time and space, although the horrific death of the criminal Kane caused her to decide to leave the Doctor and travel with Sabalom Glitz instead, hoping to keep the roguish Glitz on the straight and narrow. However, he pretty quickly sold off her possible futures to pay off his debts, and then abandoned her on the planet Rickoster. Luckily, Mel was then reunited with the Doctor and Ace, rejoining them for a significant number of adventures as a trio. Due to her knowledge of the TARDIS manual and ability to fly it better than the Doctor, the villainous Josiah W. Dogbolter manipulated Mel into delivering him the time and space machine, putting the Doctor and Ace in extreme danger. However, even after saving the day and begging the Doctor for forgiveness, Mel learned that he had manipulated her into leaving with Glitz because he knew he would need another companion. Outraged by this revelation, Mel refused to travel in the TARDIS ever again and avoided the Doctor's company, although she remained on good terms with Ace, and by 20 2010 she was working with a charitable Earth to provide computers to schools in Africa, and in 2022 she was regularly meeting up with Ace and other former companions to share their experiences. According to one account, Mel was the head of 24 Carat, a huge company, and while she was rejecting pitches from terrible products, she was reunited with the 7th Doctor and they reconciled, moving on from their past differences. Dorothy McShane, aka Ace. Long before Amy Pond, Ace was the original girl whose life made very little sense. This regular 16-year-old Earth girl stranded on an alien planet before she decided to travel with the Doctor. Besides Liz Shaw, Ace is the only companion whose exit remains unseen, and it's one of the most hotly debated. Ace would have many more adventures, although things get incredibly tricky due to her interaction with the Quantum Anvil, a temporal possibility engine splintering her life into different futures. One of these saw Ace growing disillusioned with the Doctor and joining Space Fleet to fight the Daleks, only to return as a hardened and cynical soldier 3 years after the duo split. However, they eventually reconciled and travelled with Bernice Summerfield as a trio. Another possible future saw Ace becoming Time's vigilante on a time bike patrolling Paris 1887, and she was in a relationship with Count Nikolai Sorin. Oh, and she may or may not have f***ed a man to death. Yeah, the 90s were weird. Another fairly well documented future saw Ace and the Doctor travelling with Hex, a nurse from London in 2021, who eventually sacrificed himself and survived as Hector, an identical man without any memories of being Hex. Ace and Hector would form a romantic relationship until his memories were restored and he chose to settle down in 2020's Liverpool alongside fellow ex-companion Sally Morgan, having a daughter named Cassandra. In the most corroborated timeline, Ace trained as a Time Lord and became a CIA agent working for Romana with her own TARDIS. However, during a Time War mission with Irving Braxatel, the Doctor's brother returned her to Earth and wiped her memory of the war. Ace would then dedicate her life to her charity, A Charitable Earth, along with giving sociology lectures as a professor. Despite this, she would still encounter trouble in the form of Daleks at Coal Hill in 2016, along with reuniting with the 7th Doctor to fight rogue Time Lord the 11, although she left again on bad terms. At Childhood's End claims that the 13th Doctor met Ace in 2020, where the former companions still found it hard to trust the Doctor, but still accepted the Time Lord's help and they somewhat made amends. Upon Sarah Jane's death, Ace adopted K9, and in 2022, she briefly found herself working alongside St. John Colchester of Torchwood. Power of the Doctor reveals that in the primary timeline, Ace didn't meet the Doctor in 2020, and in fact met her in 2022 due to Ace's ties with Kate Stewart and Tegan Jovanka, where they fought against the Master and a collection of the Doctor's enemies, culminating in the 13th Doctor's regeneration. After this, Ace would attend meetings organised by fellow former companion Graham O'Brien, who had continued the Doctor's work after he left the TARDIS by travelling the world investigating strange phenomena. Rose Tyler. Potentially Sarah Jane Smith's only competition for the title of most iconic Doctor Who companion, Rose Tyler was the human face of the modern show's revival, helping the 9th Doctor overcome his grief of the Time War and travelling entire dimensions to reunite with the 10th Doctor after their heartbreaking separation after the Battle of Canary Wharf. Soon after overcoming the Daleks' plan to destroy reality itself, Rose settled down in Peaceworld with her Metacrisis Doctor, and they lived in Canticum where they had a child called Mia. When President Harriet Jones combined the Preachers and Torchwood to create UNIT, Rose, the Metacrisis Doctor, Jackie and Pete all joined the organisation. When Mia was a teenager, Rose formed a pseudo-temporal link with a parallel timeline version of herself, whatever that means, who was an Empress after liberating Earth from the Sea Devils and travelling through the universe trying to spread peace through war. Rose was pulled into Endspace and met the 8th and 11th Doctors, who tried to show Empress Rose the error of her ways. Together they all fought Sontarans, and the two Doctors made both Roses touch in order to cause a Blinovitch limitation effect to defeat the Sontarans. The Doctors then took Rose home, and she lived happily ever after. Probably, I don't know. Martha Jones and Mickey Smith. Much like Leela, Martha had to try and replace greatness, which often led to issues between her and the Doctor. However, over time she proved herself and left the TARDIS due to the events of the traumatizing year that never was. She joined UNIT as a Doctor, helping Torchwood with multiple investigations, and temporarily filled in for Owen Harper. During this time she also got engaged to Thomas Milligan, although at some point before 2009 they separated. After the Medusa Cascade incident, Martha turned down a permanent job at Torchwood due to the deaths of Owen and Tosh. Later on, Martha had another adventure with Gwen Cooper, resulting in the former faking her death to leave UNIT and go freelance with her eventual husband Mickey Smith, with the two on honeymoon during the 456 incident. At some point, Martha became good friends with Sarah Jane Smith, often meeting up for coffee, and in 2010 the couple attended Luke Smith's farewell party before he left for university. At some point in 2011, Martha called the 11th Doctor in to help the Japanese branch of UNIT deal with an Axon incursion. And lastly, in 2016, Martha was turned into a gargoyle due to the effects of a wormhole passing through San Francisco. Yeah, it's weird. She turned into a gargoyle. Funniest thing I've ever seen. However, when Mickey called for the Doctor to help, it was the 9th incarnation who would arrive. Together they would close the wormhole and go their separate ways. With the 9th Doctor gaining a newfound respect for Mickey, he would carry into his later interactions with a younger version of him. By 2020, Mickey and Martha would attend Sarah Jane Smith's funeral service with their son August. Please be aware that this features spoilers for upcoming episodes, so just skip ahead to this timestamp if you don't want to be spoiled. Donna Noble. One of the most polarizing companions in the show's history, the sassy and outspoken redhead wanted to travel with the Doctor forever, only to lose her memories after taking part in the Metacrisis exchange. However, she found love with Sean Temple, and together they had a daughter named Rose. After the 13th Doctor regenerated into a temporary incarnation resembling the 10th Doctor, he and Donna reunited for a brief stint in the TARDIS, with Donna's memories restored. Amy Pond and Rory Williams. The only married couple to regularly travel in the TARDIS so far on screen, 11th Doctor companions Amy Pond and Rory Williams faced a tragic departure as a weeping angel sent them back to 1930s New York, where the Doctor could never see them again. However, their biological daughter River Song travelled back in time to give them the royalties to the first two Melody Malone books so that together they could buy a house legitimately. River then handed over the writing of the series to Amy, who would go on to be an accomplished author writing Summer Falls and a famous novel titled Night Thief of Ill Harbour. Rory became a full-time doctor, and in 1946 they adopted a son named Anthony, who lived long enough to meet his grandfather in the present day. However, when Anthony was growing up, Rory would regularly film video diaries for his son on his iPhone, where he recounted stories of his and Amy's lives and their travels with the Doctor. By 1969, Amy and Rory lived in the Upper West Side of New York, and they had holidays in Florida and Washington, watching from afar their adventures with the Doctor and Canton. Around this period of time, Amy also dedicated a lot of her personal time to looking for a young Melody Pond on the streets of New York, while Rory had introduced multiple innovations within the medical community, such as Williams Wonder Beds. Amy died at 87, 5 years after Rory, and they were buried together after a happy life. Clara Oswald. Effectively the 12th Doctor's definitive companion, Clara Oswald began her journeys with the 11th Doctor and grew close with 12, to the extent that she lost her life trying to act like him. The Doctor attempted to save her life using Time Lord technology, with Clara now travelling through time in a TARDIS of her own with a shielder, but so far nothing is known of this period of time. However, her appearance on the battlefield shortly before the Doctor's regeneration shows us that she did indeed return to Trap Street to face her death, maintaining the timeline and becoming part of Testimony, helping the 12th Doctor accept his own death and regeneration. Nardole. After losing both his platonic soulmate and then his romantic soulmate, the 12th Doctor repaired the cyborg Nardole to keep him company. He was basically a comic relief point and laugh person, always nagging the Doctor and making passive aggressive remarks. However, after spending at least 1,000 years with the Doctor, Nardole stayed behind on a Mondasian colony ship to defend colonists from the rapidly evolving Cybermen, although the conflict eventually became largely peaceful. One time he broke both his legs in a banana meadow, so the children pushed him around in a wheelbarrow, and he ultimately lived to the ripe old age of 728, with 6 different wives. Nardole was then accidentally taken in by Testimony, which mistook him for a human, but allowed him to stay after after he asked very nicely. Bill Potts. Bill Potts was a simple university cafeteria chef who blossomed into a smart and confident student under the tutelage of the 12th Doctor. However, her travels aboard the TARDIS were tragically cut short when she was killed and turned into a Cyberman. After aiding the Doctor in a brave yet futile last stand, Bill seemingly died too, only for the puddle entity Heather to return for her and turn her into a sentient oil creature too, the pair travelling the universe together. However, Bill eventually decided to become human again, returning to her studies at St. Luke's and living a normal life with Heather, the couple buying a home, clubbing, and adopting cats together. Bill kept in touch with Nardole, who remained on the Mondasian colony ship, but when she began to die of old age, Bill gave Heather permission to return to her travels. Bill then passed away and became part of Testimony alongside Nardole and Clara. So that's pretty much all we know at this moment in time. Given the ongoing nature of Doctor Who, there's always going to be more stuff coming out showing what happened to all these characters long after they left the TARDIS. So this video will probably end up aging like milk fairly quickly. But for now, I hope you learned plenty of interesting new details about the later lives of companions. I'm sure I got a few things wrong, and you'll undoubtedly write essays in the comments correcting me, but there was a lot of information to try and sift through and organise. If anything I talked about interests you at all, you should definitely look into some Doctor Who expanded media because some of it is really good and adds a lot to the show's universe. I hope you liked this video, and if you want other big scale lore based videos like this in the future, be sure to let me know, and I'll see you next time. Thanks for watching. And I'd like to give an extra special thank you to my Asbantium level patron Fallon Cortez, my Platinum level patron Maximilian Foreman, and all my Gold level patrons Calvin, Daniel Shillito, Franzorn aka Line Vortex, Gog Nogler, Herna Verzog, and Luke_SY. Thank you so much for your support.